Thanks, Steve. Tout. Hi, Mike. Hi, Carl. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We've been trying to make identity better for as long as I can remember, at least 25 years on the internet. We go back to some of the early authentication work that was done by APEC, including the US and Canada and Australia in the late 1990s. About 10 years ago, blockchain came along, Bitcoin blockchain, at just the right time. Because about 10 years ago, we were in the middle of some enormous federation projects, grand federation, I call it, the idea of public-private partnerships where you could reuse your identity across healthcare and education and banking and government. At about the same time, I guess the term surveillance capitalism was starting up, and we were certainly getting into a whole lot of anger and revolt, absolute revolt about some of the early business models of the internet. Bitcoin, of course, was purely political. First and foremost, it was political. It was an expression of resentment and a fervent wish for people to take control of their money, and more broadly of their data. At about that time, NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, as well as the UK equivalent, these things started to hit their hit the wall. Both of those programs have subsequently folded because it turns out that identity is harder than we thought it was. It was certainly the way it was framed. Hey, let's reuse my identity across education and banking. It turns out to be a naive way of framing things based on intuitions about what identity is all about. So blockchain comes along, and it raises for me two questions. One, philosophically, if you like, and we get this interesting merger of philosophy and practicality in identity, don't we? Where philosophy becomes very important very quickly. The important question, whether it's philosophical or not, is whether or not identity is the sort of thing that you can decentralize, or whether you should decentralize. Decentralization is, frankly, it's almost religious insofar as people think that it's intrinsically good. And I think that it's naive to apply decentralization across the board. The other specific question about identity and blockchain is whether or not there's a double spend problem in identity, because that was the genius of the Bitcoin blockchain. If you can't find a double spend problem, then you need to sort of pull back and wonder whether distributed ledger technology is a natural fit for identity. Now, it's definitely clever to use distributed ledger technologies for some of the new things that's going on around decentralized IDs. Definitely clever to be able to create your own identifier and put it on a ledger and prove that that was unique. The hard thing, though, is still making that what we call the off-chain link, the analog to digital. A blockchain can be out there in the cloud proving uniqueness of an ID. How do I know it's my ID? How do I know, technically, how do I prove possession of the private key? How do I prove binding of that key pair to me? And those problems are not intrinsically fixed by the blockchain. Now, I know that I've made some sweeping generalizations, and there'll be people out there that are champing at the bit, Steve, we've moved on, that's unfair. And absolutely, I'm talking about where we were 10 years ago. Constellation Research through 2020 has done a whole new market overview of decentralized identities and self-sovereign identities. And what I want to do today is talk about some really important shifts that have occurred in the last few years. We've found this through our research, and there's some really good news about hybrid models and a much more sophisticated view, a much more sophisticated framing of what identity is really all about. Now, can I move this down? Cool. So our research findings, we've been tracking for, certainly earlier than 2020, we've been tracking a very distinct trend in identity, deliberate air quotes. The preoccupation of identity has shifted from personal identity, who am I, through to more objective claims and attributes about me. In other words, what am I in context? What am I? Am I a student? Am I a bank account holder? Am I a Visa card holder? Am I a citizen of Australia? all sorts of commentators are making this distinction now between who and what. Along the way, identifiers are cool again. A lot of identity management over the last 10 years has been about a rejection of identifiers, and certainly learning the hard way that when we use identifiers as authenticators, social security number being the classic, that the road to hell is paved with the reuse of identifiers as authenticators. It's a very soft form of knowledge-based authentication. It's kind of pathetic. But the sophisticated view is that you don't just get rid of identifiers. Identifiers are actually cool if you can keep them in context. If you can keep your social security number for indexing your social security databases, why not? Let's just make sure that these things are purpose specific. And that's an idea in privacy about use specificity and purpose specification. Now, language is evolving. The way that we talk about identity, the way that we imagine identity is evolving, and our expectations are evolving with it. If I was to put my finger on the most important thing that's shifted in the last 5 years, it's about sovereignty. Remember 10 years ago, very, very political, sovereignty is like a calling card. It's like a call to action about reclaiming control. The thing that we've realized is that sovereignty is a two-way street. I've got sovereignty, but you know, the relying party's got sovereignty too. In fact, we've known this forever in federated identity. The most successful programs in federated identity are very, very careful to get the relying parties to the table. So things like the FIDO Alliance, I think primarily in terms of management and politics and acceptance of the FIDO Alliance, has all hinged on the very clever thing they did was to get relying parties at the table and to recognize the interests and rights in relying parties to actually set the rules for identification. So Steve Tout picked up on something provocative I said a few years ago, which is I don't think there are any identity providers in the way that we imagine it. A lot of identity is framed around the idea that identity is some sort of good, or it's a product or a service. You know, it's something that we provide, it's something that we consume, it's something that we federate. And that mental model and framing of identity as a thing has driven us into some missteps. So sovereignty, whose is it? It's a relationship. Identity is a relationship, and that's a term that is becoming more and more current as well. The headlines of self-sovereign identity these days are things like portability, agency, definitely the political idea that I need agency over my identity and my data, and verifiability, a pretty straightforward engineering term. If some data is being presented over the internet, how do you know? How do you verify that it's come from the expected place, that it's been provided with consent? One of the, I don't think he'll mind me quoting him, Phil Windley, the chair of the Sovereign Foundation, said something very important a couple of years ago. He said that within the Sovereign Foundation ecosystem, there is no artifact called identity. And that speaks of this shift towards verifiable credentials, verified pieces of data. So we're rebalancing the mission. The self-sovereign identity mission started out as being very political, and now it's about relationships. We are accommodating the establishment. I think our politics is getting more sophisticated. Sometimes it's a bit sort of adolescent. Sometimes it's a bit angry. Sometimes it's about manning the barricades and fighting off big bad government and big bad banks. But almost all self-sovereign projects that I'm close to now talk about accommodating attestations, accommodating the traceability of claims. Where did a claim come from? If I'm trying to pretend that I'm over 21, is there a DMV? Who's making that claim on my behalf? So accommodating institutions, accommodating the existing sources of truth we have is super, super important. And finally, something that's come through our research and has been echoed by some other folks like Nick Byrne in Australia with the Red Cross, is we're identifying a bit of an obsession with governance. And I've got a theory about governance. Anybody in tech with a long memory will remember things like the Enron problem in the year 2000, the breakup of the big accounting firms and the consultancies. we have this long cycle. Every 10 years or so, there's a big blow up. There's a white collar crime scandal. There's a rejig, and of course we're about to see it with the potential breakups of the technology companies in the US. I think that there's a natural reversion to governance that a lot of technologists have, because they get faced with the stark reality that this is not just about technology, but it's about rules. And faced with that, we've learned over time, technologists have learned that governance is kind of the safe place. It's politically correct to go into governance. And I've got no problem with that, but I think that we are obsessing over governance. And what I mean by that is that the world, notwithstanding the fact that we have Enron and Ponzi schemes from time to time, by and large, we know how to do governance. And by and large, governance rests on existing trust frameworks. In identity, we are obsessed with trust frameworks. We technologists and technology policy people spend a lot of time, an inordinate amount of time, building new trust frameworks. And I've got to say that, you know, the curious thing is that when you go to one of these seminars about trust frameworks, the first thing that a technologist will tell you is that the world is full of trust frameworks. The Visa, Mastercard schemes, driver licensing, the way that we run our health institutions, these are all trust frameworks. They are blends of governance and rules and legislation in many cases, as well as technology, chip card technology, the rails that the payment system runs on, the rails that process passports at border control. All of these complicated systems of rules, governance, legislation and technology, they're really what civilization's built on. I don't think we need any more of that. I think the trick for identity is going to be to take the identities and the relationships that we have that by and large are working pretty well and digitize them more faithfully, take them from the analog to the digital. Now, I am glossing over the fact, obviously, that there's all sorts of problems and all sorts of imperfections, and we need to make these things better and better all the time. But I don't think that we should start from just throwing away physical and analog identity and coming up with a whole new digital trust system. So look, what's working? What's impactful? Zero knowledge proofs, fantastic technology. How do you prove a particular thing about somebody using cryptography, using hardware keys? Let's go back if you can, Steve. And in fact, zero knowledge proofs is a bit of an idea that's been around for a long time. We can trace some of that back to PKI. I love wallets. We still need to go back. I love the metaphor of wallets. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. Private key media, good quality private keys. How do you make sure that there's some cryptographic magic is in the right hands and that it's being used under control and that things are in the possession of who you think they are. Tremendous progress being made by the W3C in particular, the World Wide Web Consortium, on building things like verified credentials into the plumbing and making them absolutely web standard. And finally, I don't think we're going to get into a lot of detail today, but with the DID, the Decentralized Identity Movement, there's a standard now for what's been called DID documents, and that's a beautiful standard. It's like a lightweight form of digital certificates that allows you to make statements about identifier holders and to make sure that those statements are verifiable. And I think that that's going to be one of the lasting legacies of the DID movement, will be the DID document. Now, what's questionable? I want to challenge a few things. I think that we need to keep thinking about how we're framing identity. The idea that you own identity, I think that's frankly questionable. In fact, more broadly, the idea that you own data is questionable. I don't think that we should be encouraging people to try and own data. It's so intangible. It's so contested. I don't know a lawyer that will tell you that owning identity is sort of a conceptually simple or straightforward thing to do. We are rebooting the web of trust. We're really bouncing around a lot. If we could stick on that slide, that'd be cool. Rebooting web of trust. Look, I am the first to admit that PKI has got all sorts of problems, but I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some tremendous work being done there, but the political calling, the the protest movement of that we need to reboot the web of trust, we need to restore that, we need to have distributed PKI. That's difficult, and those slogans, I think, can be confusing and misleading. And finally, I want to suggest that a lot of what we're doing here is a mashup between that fervent desire to regain control of our personal data and to try and firewall our data to stop it being abused behind our backs, mashing up that very important problem with identity. I think that identity and data are actually different. I also think that identity is a very blunt instrument for regaining control. I think that the world's most powerful, richest people in history are out there using our data behind our backs. I hate it, but these people are so powerful. Let's be careful to not presume that if I could own my identity, even if that was possible, do you really think that owning your own identity is going to stop the social media companies of the world selling your stuff to advertisers? They're going to figure out other ways of doing it. The cleverest people in the room are figuring out how to use our data, and it's not going to be simple to stop that. It's going to require regulations and legislation, I think. So the final slide to wrap this up. I'm going to talk about consumerization of identity. I think that the most important kind of way to string all this together is to try and reframe identity into data protection, and to try and deliver it to people with mental models and tools that make sense to the average person. This is why wallets are so important. It's a powerful mental model. It gives you control over specific pieces of data, and it shifts the thinking from identity. You know, when I check into an airport, I'm not wandering around talking about my personal identity and my DNA. I'm waving around two things. I'm waving around my boarding pass, and I'm waving around my Qantas Club entry. And I don't want people to know anything more about me than the fact that I'm on this flight, and I'm going to go in and get a beer in the Qantas Club. So that idea of wallets, I think, is super important. And you know, we've been trained now through banking wallets and through Apple wallets, Samsung wallets, to start to frame this thing in a way that's really natural. Technically, the other thing too, of course, is that merging that mental model with the physical model of the mobile phone is very potent. The phone is the second factor. That's what the FIDO Alliance is all about. We're going to get rid of passwords because our phone is always in a state. It's a dependable state. It's a second factor. It's got cryptography, biometric best practice. You know, unlock a phone with a template kept on the device. Embedded cryptography, the secure elements, super powerful. It's what we tried to do with smart cards 15 years ago, and now it's ubiquitous. So that's the prelude to the IoT, folks. This device is a prototype for what's going to happen with our fitness devices, our smart cars, and our smart clothing. All of these things are going to have embedded cryptographic elements, embedded credentials, verifiable credentials, and they're going to be talking to each other with the minimum disclosure of personal information. They're going to be talking to each other without identity. They're going to be talking to each other about verifiable pieces of data in the right hands. We're going to take identity out of the equation. The less we say about identity in the next 5 or 10 years, the safer we're all going to be, because that's how we're going to normalize risk management and trust. Thanks for that intro. I've really enjoyed sharing those things. We're going to see whether it's annoyed or provoked anybody in the chat
today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. That was a great introduction, a great first segment, Steve. You know, my head was nodding all the way through that. The way that your research and what you found is really married to what we've seen out in the trenches, working with enterprise organizations and consumers about what they envision decentralization to mean, what they interpret identity or self-sovereign identity. It invokes a lot of very passionate debate, right? And at the end of the day, nobody really knows what it is. And you nailed it. What it is, to me anyway, is a collection of all the metadata. My identity is not some magical thing, right? It's a collection of everything that I interact with and in my day-to-day life. And what we're going to talk about a little bit here is how industry is moving into a decentralized platform, and why that's important. So why it's important to the enterprise, what are some of the features and benefits, but also why it's important to the consumer, why it's important to you and I. We'll touch on that a little bit because ultimately that is the driver that's going to bring adoption. We, as enterprise organizations, can change anything about ourselves, but that will very rarely trickle down into popular culture until popular culture is ready to accept it. And if we want to see verifiable credentials, and if we want to see things like all of my prescriptions and health history and things like that under my control in an identity wallet, then we have to stimulate a movement on the consumer side to adopt verifiable credentials. And that comes with partnering with enterprise to create solutions. So let's dive into this. So we know that decentralization is a new business paradigm, and we've seen it for a number of years now, right? We've seen the enterprise struggle with social integration, reluctantly bringing social authentication into their business process. And that was really one of the starting points to the decentralized movement. And now we're seeing a whole new initiative with all of the things that Steve was talking about. We're seeing DMV organizations issuing digital driver's license. We're seeing, I know the Social Security Administration is working on something here in the US for digital representations of that. So anything that we have in our physical possession today, there are organizations working through the digital equivalents of that. And that is really, really good news for us as consumers because it is going to help simplify our lives and help us respond to those zero knowledge proofs, right? Instead of having to uh, over entitle people with our information as we go through our normal day to day activities. The biggest takeaway is, and this rarely happens in technology, as we evolve the technology, it becomes better and easier for the organizations as well as for the end users and consumers. It becomes easier for us to present those types of things and build those proofs. So as we move into this, where is the enterprise today? So the enterprise today is either in a centralized model or they're in a federated model using protocols like OAuth, OpenID, or SAML. And we're moving quickly because of all the factors I just mentioned and all of the people that are into and issuing digital representations of identity or digital representations of metadata related to your identity to them, who you are to them. We're moving quickly into this third column of decentralization. And what is that going to do? We remember the disruption where all of enterprise organizations were dependent on and waiting for their IAM vendors to retrofit and support uh, technologies like OpenID and OAuth and SAML so that we could incorporate common service delivery. The next thing was we were waiting on the IAM vendors to retool again so that we could deploy things like multi-factor or two-factor authentications. And all of that stuff is expensive and hard to maintain. And that is the promise of why decentralization is going to help with alleviating some of those concerns. So how do we get there, right? This is the big question is how do we get there and what does that technology look like that's going to drive us to that new future? Well, the verifiable credential, and this is a high level representation, but the verifiable credential data model puts you and I as the holders of that information in the middle of this process. This is not traditional, right? Traditionally, you're issued a username and password by an organization and you bring that and that organization can be anything, a service, anything that we interact with. You know, we've all got thousands or hundreds of them personally. So the verifiable credential definition changes this, right? Now we have a verifier that has the ability to verify any of that information that I'm holding and doesn't have to go back through the issuer to do that. Traditional federated protocols like OAuth or OpenID require OAuth and SAML require us to go back through that central issuer in order to facilitate that request. And in doing that, we're exposing a lot of information, a lot of behavior, a lot of things about our use of a particular service or product to that issuer who has to facilitate that connection. With verifiable credentials, we fracture that, and it's more of a triangle now of trust between the issuer that has given me that credential and an external party who's asking for verification of that. So that is all done. As Steve mentioned, inside decentralized identifiers, the DID spec is incredibly important, and that will carry on through the evolution of however that is being delivered today. And the popular delivery method today are public blockchains. There are many on the market now, and they're coming on the market every day. Public utilities or other enterprise utility blockchains that are all using a common underlying fabric to interoperate and communicate between one another, which is incredibly good news, and it's incredibly exciting to see that evolution. However, the business is still challenged with how they get there, right? So we need to talk about interoperability. We need to talk about integration. And we cannot have those conversations with enterprise customers starting with a forklift. Yeah, absolutely. They've heard this story so many times as they move from IAM vendor A to IAM vendor B. And having that conversation again with a new technology is not productive or cost effective. And and so it's important for us as an industry, we have a responsibility to say, great, all this new technology is fantastic, but how do we put that in people's hands so that they understand how they can take advantage of these new technology innovations without fundamentally changing the underlying infrastructure of their service delivery today? So it's important that we continually improve on the incremental adoption points, and that we leverage those existing protocols that are in existence today. So um, we have to be able to understand that the enterprise has a very huge investment in SAML, OAuth, and technologies like that to help them deliver services to their customers. And if we go in and say you're turning off A so that you can turn on B, it's very disruptive, and it won't scale. So IdRamp is coming to market basically saying let's build this bridge, right? Let's help build these bridges, and provide the ability for these organizations to create their own ecosystems and create their own, uh, uh, the governance conversation that Steve was alluding to is an important thing. We hear that all the time. How do we create this governance with us and our partners? And so IdRamp is trying to really help foster the adoption of some of that. So we have within the platform the ability to issue verifiable credentials from any standards-based identity source or any standards-based uh, uh, source like an Active Directory or something like that, which allows an organization to say, okay, we want to transition from username and password to an employee ID credential, for example. And we can do that seamlessly by interfacing with an existing system and doing that issuance. We also have the other side of that, which we can help organizations do their service delivery with those verifiable credentials that are now issued, because it's not enough to just issue a verifiable credential. We also have to provide a way that they can be consumed and used in a business process. So any process or any application that knows how to speak today's language of OAuth, SAML, or OpenID can be retrofitted immediately to support verifiable credentials. And that's a really important thing as we move forward. We're going to see other integrations in that area coming. We feel like we're helping the industry kind of realize that need and stimulating some adoption. Of course, the beautiful thing about this technology is that it can allow for evolution without vendor dependency. So we will see, we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about some of our success tips or things. But the really important thing about this is you can use a vendor to issue a verifiable credential. You can use a vendor to help you verify a verifiable credential. But at the end of the day, the credential itself is a standard. So you can move from one system to another system without having to reinvent, which is not the case with a traditional IAM vendor today. If you leave Active Directory in favor of Google's G Suite, it's a complete, there might be migration tools, but it's a very disruptive process. The user experience is certainly nowhere near the same. And with underlying verifiable credentials, you can keep all of that the same and consistent. So some other things, the API fabric is very important to be able to extend those capabilities programmatically. for issuing and verifications. Those are all things that we need to consider. And I mentioned the ecosystem. It's very important to not only say, these are my customers, but or my employees, but maybe these are my customers and their employees, and being able to build your own sense of how you're going to deliver cases like that in the industry. So some important things that we're working on. These are actual. I'm going to jump to the case studies, Carl. These are actual use cases that we are working on. So we have in our organization active projects in each of these spaces where an organization is retrofitting an existing model for identity and service delivery with verifiable credentials. And I'm really happy to say that in some of these use cases, it's not only IdRamp providing the vendor tools to do this. So because the technology is so interoperable, we can work in, say, education or utilities with a particular organization that might be using our tools to issue and do their verifiable credentials, and it's completely interchangeable and usable by another organization that may be using their own. Maybe they've built those tools themselves, or they're using a different vendor to bring those credentials in. And that is the portability that is key to all of this. That's the most important takeaway from verifiable credentials, is the portability. I can take something that has been issued to me, and you can verify that without having to have that direct relationship back to the issuing organization. And when you think about what that does for identity, for service delivery, for things like I mentioned in the healthcare, being able to put portability of those health records. I can go into clinic A and they can issue me a prescription. I can go to the pharmacy. They don't have to do any validation. They can verify that that credential that I have been given was issued by a certain clinic on a certain date, and that I'm the only holder of that. They can do that cryptographically. It makes that experience so much easier. You can imagine, the pharmacy vending machines of the future, right? Where you just walk up and you scan a code, and it does a check to make sure that you're you, looks at the credential, and just, your penicillin drops out the bottom, just like a Snickers bar today. So lots of things that are going to evolve and happen with this technology as it progresses. We've also worked in recruiting, so we're working on some really interesting solutions with background checks. You can imagine how that's going to completely alter identity as well, or employment pre-scans. If an employer you can go to an employment interview, right, and you're able to present the background check, you're able to present your educational background, and all of that stuff can be immediately verified. It's a huge advantage to you not having to gather all that information, but also to those organizations that are trying to make those decisions. It really simplifies and reduces the cost of their background in checking all of those things. So the SaaS providers, we talked about that a little bit. This is basically any cloud service that in the world can use verifiable credentials today, because there are bridges that exist between OAuth, OIDC, SAML, things of that nature to do that. And we offer that service to any SaaS provider. We're working with a number of them right now that are extending their traditional username password based login to their SaaS service with a verifiable credential, in most cases rooted simply in a verified email. That's all they really need to allow users into their service. In other cases, they want to check things that are a little more specific, but there's a lot of those integrations going on right now. And I think you're going to see an almost viral adoption of SaaS services using verifiable credentials for authorization and onboarding, because it reduces their risk. They don't have to store that identity data. And in very, very small cases, there are organizations trying to profit from that data. The general, what we hear from our customers is most of them want that data as far away as possible. They don't really want to store it. They just feel like they have to, because they have to do password resets and all of that stuff. So by incorporating verifiable credentials into those traditional login flows, it improves their security, because they're not housing all of that data, while at the same time simplifying the usability of the service by giving the end user an easier way to provide that. They no longer have to store or know password. All they have to do is have a credential on their phone that you can present on request, and move on. So some of our success tips are things that we think are important when we're talking about this in the industry. So if you talk to any of your peers or customers, and they're asking about the adoption of this, we always stay as far away from the technology as possible. If you are familiar with our products or have seen, and we certainly encourage you to come and take a look, but we don't mention cryptography. We don't mention ledgers. We don't mention DIDs. We always focus on the business problem. And the business problem is, as I just went through, how do we remove usernames and passwords? How do we increase portability? How do we issue an employee credential and immediately consume that across our entire ecosystem of services, from logging into your email to getting through the physical proximity sensor in the the office? All of those things can reuse that same credential, and we dramatically reduce our footprint of data. Always start with small projects. Always start with a very small, focused solution. We're able to get in the door with a message like, let's just eliminate your password. That's all we're going to do. We're going to go to the user community. We're going to eliminate their passwords. That's our primary objective. From there, the technology always blooms and evolves into other use cases. But it's really beneficial to start with a very focused solution. The third thing that's really important is to leverage the existing systems. We talked about that before. By leveraging the existing identity system, we can immediately take the very complex process that exists within an enterprise today and add a simple augmentation to that for verifiable credential issuance. So instead of some massive project where we export or we generate or we determine who's going to have, and we create in doing that, create another identity silo, by the way, that we have to deal with someday. We just integrate or leverage with an existing process that is governed by existing models, and it accelerates the adoption dramatically because we can very slowly introduce the solutions that that technology can employ. Obviously, measuring the performance indicators is huge, and anything that we can show about the adoption and how that is happening, how many people, okay, we deployed our verifiable credentials in front of this one service, and to everybody in our human resources group, for example, how is that adoption? Who's using it? And we can draw some immediate business value on how we can further invest in the technology. So real quickly, let's talk about a few of our industry affiliations, and then I want to get on to taking some questions. We are Trust Over IP steering group leaders and founding members. So we very, very firmly believe in the network of networks, as all of these utility ledgers come on to do identity, which is, by the way, we didn't cover this really, but I mean, Steve was talking about the evolution. Some of the things that we have going on in the industry now, where the ledger is being used only for the verification. It's never holding any data. That's what's really led to this explosion of the network of networks, where all these networks are now coming online, because we're not exposing information by writing it to the ledger. That never happens. All of those credentials are held internally and on your wallet inside your mobile device. And the verification of those can be done, as Steve said, in zero knowledge, which is it's a game changer, right? Instead of saying, here is my driver's license, you can just say, are you over 18? Yes. And so very, very, a very important thing that's happening. A lot of that is being driven inside the Trust Over IP Foundation, and we're happy for that involvement. We're also stewards on Sovereign's Network. We sit on the Steward Council, so we're actively governing how that network evolves and grows. Also founding members and steward operators on Indicio's network. Indicio is a commercially minded ledger for enterprise. And they're also incredibly good with governance and spinning up individual ledgers for an organization. So lots of fun things happening with that relationship. And we're founding stewards on the Bedrock network, which is due out later this year, and that's going to be an IBM IBM blockchain geared toward commercial use as well. So lots of stuff going on, and please reach out. We're excited to talk to you. Carl's got a link here on this next slide to go to our site, request a demonstration or just a meeting. We'd love to talk. We'd love to talk more.
Steve, there was a question that came across. Looks like you want to answer that one about the Mastercard and Visa.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. If people can see the question, I've said that there's no identity providers, and the question is, what about Mastercard and Visa and all of the others? Will decentralized identity affect their roles in the ecosystem? This is a very subtle point, but the thing about identity is that it's in the eye of the beholder. It is the merchant that says, I am Steve Wilson. I can go in there with all of the papers in the world and try and convince them of who I am, but they make the decision. So identification, when they set a flag and say, I know this guy, the identity is actually being defined by the relying party. It's a bit of an upsetting thing to realize, but it's important because it's about risk and relationships. Clearly, Visa and Mastercard and banks and DMVs are doing what they do. So I'm not saying those organizations don't exist, but I think that what they're doing is not providing identity. I think they're providing data. I think they're providing verifiable pieces of data. And when we talk about ecosystems, natural ecosystems are about survival of the fittest. Business ecosystems are about survival of the ones that provide most value. And the value here is verifiable data. A credit card is actually the original verifiable credential. A chip and PIN card proves a little piece of data. It proves my Visa card number, and it proves that the issuing bank gave me that Visa card number, and it's verifiable in a chip, an official chip. It's a beautiful thing. I think that we need to drop down a level, and instead of saying that Visa, Visa doesn't say this is Steve Wilson. In fact, Visa says very little about me, but they talk about my Visa number, and that's absolutely verifiable and absolutely valuable. So I think that as we shift focus, the ecosystem is only going to get stronger and stronger. And these tools, decentralized identities, DID documents, the architecture, the decentralized architecture, which allows us to verify things locally without calling home to base, these are very powerful patterns.
Yeah, I would add to that, Steve, saying that the verifiable credential architecture gives us the ability to separate identity, meaning who you are, to more of a identity, who you are to me, right? That's the interesting takeaway, is that all of the services that I interact with, including the DMV and places like that, don't necessarily, they are not me, right? But in their own data silos, I am, right? Because that's the way it's always been done. This technology and the ability for our organizations, or any organization, to pull that information or request that information over those established connections that exist through the issuance of those verifiable credentials, give us the ability to change that dialogue from, oh, you are Mike, to this is who you are to me, as Steve said. It's the attributes. It's that I am legally able to drive. It's that, it's the attributes, and that's the really subtle shift.
And that has really come through in our research, that attributes and preserving relationships. So to just riff on Mike's point there about the way that things have always been done, the biggest problem with federated identity going back 10 years is that it disrupted the way that people do business. It forced you as a relying party to go somewhere else for data. Even if that's a better way of doing business, it's a huge shift. And the switching cost killed NSTIC, it killed UK Verify. The trick now is to preserve the way that we do business, right or wrong. It's 95% right. We have ways of dealing with people. We have ways of establishing relationships. We have ways of using the DMV to prove particular things about me. We've got KYC rules, which, you know, largely they suck, but the rules are you need to check certain things to open a bank account. We should preserve these things, and the verifiable credentials is a beautiful technology for allowing people to preserve the way that they do business when they go digital.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that came in. Steve or Mike, do one of you want to jump on that one? From Keaton, how do you see the examiner role from a vetting perspective within the context of decentralized identity?
I would ask Keaton to kind of expand that a little bit if he could. And I mean, are you talking about a verifier or the examiner role? What exactly are you asking there? I guess I don't understand the question in that context.
Keaton, I've opened your mic if you want to elaborate, or you can just type the question.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So really, I think, you know, obviously, as we look at sort of the DID context, right? So obviously, you have a self-attestation process, but as you want to start verifying people, you also need someone who's sort of ensuring and vetting the process to ensure that the credentials the credentials you're providing are these verified through some parties, right? So really the question boils down to is that I think there's a lot of solutions out there that do sort of, you know, provide the concept of self-attestation, but if you want to provide DID in a larger context, right, you need someone to do that vetting to ensure that is this correct, right? So just by me scanning my driver's license and doing a self-attestation, that may not be good enough.
Right. No, you're exactly right. But the beauty of the technology is that it might be good enough, right? I mean, it just depends on the context, as you mentioned. So a big thing with, you know, Sovereign, for example, is it's the most well-established identity-based or Indy-based blockchain network or ledger network on the market today. And their governance is very specific about who can author transactions, right? And so you have to be a transaction endorser and go through and agree to all of the stuff and be pre-vetted before you can issue a credential based on a definition that you've written to that network. So that process then gives every verifier in the world a way to say, okay, I know that this credential that says it was signed by the California DMV was actually signed by the California DMV, right? Because the governance is thereby requiring that. And that's a big thing as we see different identity networks, or I shouldn't even call them identity networks, but the networks that are geared this way and compatible with these, with Indy-based or Aries-based credentials to date, are all structured in this governance. They all have that ability. But to my point, the reason it's so powerful is that doesn't always have to be the case. There might be a case where I just want that self-attested information, right? If I'm checking out a book at the library, maybe I just want to present that, and it just needs to be a convenience feature. And the technology looks the exact same, right? Whether it's verifiable or not is up to the verifier and whatever the context they have, to mandate. So I think
I'd like to add traceability. I'd like to add that all of these things, DID documents, is one of the powerful things about the DID document construct is that it shows the traceability. So you know where that attestation has come from. Is it self-attested? Is it attested by an institution, or is it attested by a whole startup IDP? Just back to that question about IDPs and ecosystems, the elephant in the room is that after 15 years of trying this, there are no commercially sustainable identity providers. It's not a business that people make money out of selling identities. But clearly, Visa and Mastercard and all sorts of other people, they do good business providing, verified claims. And if you know where those claims have come from, which is that attestation and traceability issue that Mike talks about, that's core capability in trust. How do you preserve those networks?
I know we're going over by a couple of minutes here. Steve, Mike, are you good on time to just take one more question, or do you need to wrap up here?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got another 5 minutes.
An interesting one that, and before I launch the question, I just want to invite anyone the webinar, who wants to continue to engage with Steve or the IdRamp team, and to see verifiable credentials in action, you can visit nonconformistinnovation.com, click on the Connect community. The Connect community is going to give you the option to see how verifiable credentials are protecting your data, and you don't have to register with a new password. It's really pretty cool. And I just invite you to do that, to continue the conversation. And after this webinar, we'll send out a replay and ways that you can contact either Constellation Research or IdRamp. So I think this question, just in closing, because I think it's really why we're here today, right? Around codes of ethics have been with us for decades, and we have GDPR, CCPA, and GAP principles, et cetera, that are supposed to help govern how data is collected and used. How have they worked? I guess that's a rhetorical question, because they're not always good at enforcing, protecting users' behavior. Can innovation for good offer consumers better protection?
I'll have a go at that, Steve. I'm less cynical than the question suggests. I think that data protection laws have actually been with us for a very long time, and they have some surprising successes under their belts, which we could go into at another time. But it's also a work in progress. I mean, clearly, the way that CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, has picked up on elements of GDPR and tried to make them fit better the American way of doing things. It's a work in progress. The point I'd make about rules, and this came through in our research, Constellation's research, is that a lot of the consumer protection that people are looking for in identity is not going to come from technology. A lot of it's going to come from rules. My take on this is that privacy is about restraint. Privacy is about a business saying, I choose not to know about Steve Wilson's sexuality, or I choose not to know about what he had for lunch. And that's a big thing. I mean, people make eye-watering amounts of money from those things. Privacy is about saying, I choose not to know about these things. That's respect. I'm going to do business with Steve. I'm going to sell him some stuff, and then I've made my money. I'm going to step back and leave the guy alone. That's privacy, and it doesn't come from technology. It comes from culture, and it also gets enforced by rules. So I think the GDPR is actually, I've called it a light on the hill. It's about how we're going to manage data and how we're going to encourage people to use data for certain things. Now, the beautiful thing about DIDs and some of these self-sovereign technologies is that they provide additional signals that allow you to know where has a piece of data come from. We get wonderful proof of possession signals, so I can tell the difference between stolen data and original data. Then you can start to take a lot of the extraneous data out. We can take out passwords, we can take out KBA. So you get data minimization, you get restraint, and that's cool. I think the next steps is that these technologies are going to allow us to add a lot more metadata so that we can add terms and conditions, we can add jurisdiction. The idea that my health record has come from a particular jurisdiction and it's been protected under certain laws, that's an important thing to know. And some of our DID documents and some of our other metadata constructs can allow those facts about where data's come from, what have I given permission for it to be used for. Those things can be attached, and those things can become portable. And the possibilities for this technology to protect data in general on a jurisdictional basis is just almost without limit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely well said. I mean, I think that the technology, when you really understand the technology and you peel back the layers, there are certainly still going to be ways that organizations can request to mine that information. Just because I, as the holder, am in the middle of that process doesn't mean I'm any more savvy or capable of protecting it from exploits. So there's always going to be importance for the governance, the legislation layers to dictate what can and can't be done, certainly. But the ability for me to be in the middle of those transactions is what sells it for me. We talked a little bit, I used the example of healthcare a little bit, but even if I have a connection with my provider and they are pushing down all of the information about prescriptions, the vitals, all that stuff to my wallet. I may not want to be in the middle of every one of those transactions. I may want to provide a blanket consent. Yes, you can push all that information. If you need to send me a bill, I give you permission to pull my address from a credential whenever you want through that existing connection. So they don't have to retain that information. And once the technology is out and capable, as capable as it is, it provides then the ability to come in and provide better privacy laws, because we can say things like, you know what, you don't need to store all of this address information. You can just go get that when you need it through the connections that are provided with the technology. So I see an absolute transaction log of everything that happens, whether I actively consent to it or I passively consent to it. I'm still in the middle, and there's so much value in that. I mean, that is, for me, that's the reason this technology simply has to become more widespread and more widely used.
Well, Steve and Mike, it's been great chatting with you guys today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and also for all the attendees who are still left, still here. I appreciate you taking the time as well. Thanks for registering and hearing about decentralized identity and verifiable credentials with these two experts. And I hope it's been valuable to you. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mike. Well done.